Welcome to the Softland Central podcast, your home for market entry knowledge and resources. Softland Central is brought to you by Softland Partners, an online marketplace to help you find best fit resources for your market entry. Find them at softlandpartners.com. Well, hi, and welcome to Softland Central. I'm Bill Kenny, and this is the hub for market entry. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Nina Walters from Expandise. Welcome, Nina.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. And you're in Berlin, where it's steamy hot. And so please drink water, keep hydrated, all that. Here on the East Coast of the US today, it is temperate, kind of a mild day with bright sunshine. So we're in good shape. So in any event, you've got some wonderful background in terms of helping companies internationalize and expand globally. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What got you into this and all that kind of fun stuff?
Sure. So I've been helping companies to expand for 8 years now, I think, overall. I've been in the international business scene generally for quite a while. And then I went for a job as a UK country manager for a startup here in Berlin. And during the interview process, I was sitting down with the CEO for the last interview. He liked me, and then he said, "You know, Nina, you've gone for the UK, and yep, I get that. I'm British. I live in Berlin, but I'm British, yeah." And he said, "But I think you can do more. Why don't you do our whole international strategy?" And I said, "Yes, that sounds like a great challenge, really great." And then 3 months after that, I'd helped them launch into 3 countries, and was sort of them pushing further on the internationalization bandwagon. And I never looked back. So I've then been helping companies around the globe to do their expansion, either in-house or freelance. And then I set up Expandise, a management consultancy, helping other companies to go international, because I really missed having my own team. So now we're slowly growing our team internally and mixing that with bringing my love of expansion and learning about other cultures to the world.
That's fantastic. So talk a little bit about the companies that you work with. What stage are they? Are there certain industries, anything like that?
Sure. So we mainly work with startups, mid-sized companies up to around sort of 150, 200 people. Usually startups sort of in venture capital VC cases that have then got money in order to expand. Generally more on the B2C side. So we work a lot with e-commerce companies, delivery companies, marketplaces, this sort of thing. Not necessarily, but they are the majority of our clients, looking either European, looking to expand within Europe, or somebody wanting to either leave Europe or enter Europe. So while we try to be vertical and geography agnostic, realistically, that's sort of the majority of the people that we work with.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And so let's maybe get into our topic here a little bit to talk about company internationalizing and entering markets. When you look at the companies that you've been working with and see in the marketplace, what are the biggest challenges they have? What are the biggest sort of hurdles and roadblocks that you see companies struggle with?
So I think because we do a lot of B2C, one of the biggest problems we see is with the product adaptation for local markets. If you're doing like B2B SaaS, for example, it's much easier to sort of replicate the same product because the vertical tends to be much stronger than the consumer behavior. Whereas when you're looking at B2C and you're looking at products that people will use in their home or in their everyday lives, how they interact with the product and how they usually use alternatives to the product become a much bigger fraction. So one of the biggest challenges is for companies to really understand what each market wants from their service and from their offering.
I would imagine too is even validating that that what problem or challenge exists in one company or country exists in the target country as well, or is it a totally different service or need that needs to be fulfilled? Do you find that as well?
Yeah, sometimes, but there's a lot of also basic things that Whichever kind of vertical or industry you're in really apply to different markets. So things like looking at payment methods. If you want to start an e-commerce company in the Netherlands, you need to use Ideal as a payment method, because I think something like 80%, maybe less than that now, of e-commerce transactions use that payment method. If you're looking at sort of credibility in an industry, if you're looking at Germany or Austria, there are little trust logos that you see on the side of every website, which means they're accredited by a third party. TÜV is a common one in Germany. Whereas if you're looking at, for example, Italy or Spain, they have less belief in these third party logos. And they're much more likely to want to see Facebook recommendations from people that they know from real people. And so this idea of credibility is very different in different markets. And that can sometimes be difficult for companies to understand and to exploit effectively.
Right, and to shift whatever the systems they have are over to accommodate that. Yeah, that totally makes sense. Are there other challenges that you see companies have? So one is sort of making sure that their product is sort of market ready and aligned with the demands and needs of that marketplace. And I guess two, from what you just talked about, is also having the various accreditations available and or systems available on their website that allow transactions to happen in that new market. Are there any other challenges that you see really companies struggle with?
I mean, there's always a million challenges, right? I'd say one of the most common that's underestimated, let's say, people get it, but it's underestimated, is the internal challenge of going to new markets. So if you're only in one country and you've got a local team, it's very different to then suddenly have experts from another country and another culture come in with potentially a different way of working, a different way of doing things. It could also be, for example, that your processes are very specifically set up for what people would then expect and to work in that particular way, but that just doesn't work for the new team. Or it could be that you've got a process that is a little bit manual because it's difficult to code or to automate, so you're doing that manually. And a lot of companies don't realize that then once you've entered a new country, that process or that manual thing hasn't been added on, it's been multiplied. So once you're in 4 or 5 countries, you don't have sort of 5 times the issue. You've got this big exponential growth of manual work that you need to do. So thinking about how to structure the team as well. Internal structure is a whole other topic, but internal structure and the processes around that is something that is often underestimated and sometimes isn't really grasped how important it is until it's a bit too late.
Got it. And so how do you work through that? Let's take that as a sort of an example to work through with this. Is there an assessment you do when you begin the process to sort of look at, taking the first topic, to look at the product or services market readiness for the new marketplace, maybe looking at the website, how aligned with it is it to how people transact business in whatever new country that is, and then the team or the operations, how sort of congruent and efficient are they going to be in this new market? Is there an initial assessment you do, or how do you unearth these items?
Yeah, so we kind of have 3 main streams of work that we do, and they all kind of converge in different ways depending on where the company is when they join us. So if we start with the market preparation aspect. So we'll go in and do a readiness check, see where they're at in terms of, do they have enough funding? Do they have their team members in place? Have they thought about X, Y, Z? And part of that X, Y, Z is looking at these local adaptations. Have they done their research? Do they understand it? To work out where they are in terms of being ready to really enter a market. If they're not ready, we help them with that. So with the research, with our own knowledge that we've got, we know we've gathered quite a bit from about various companies in different countries and verticals over the years to advise on these topics in the local adaptation aspects. This is a bit different from the sort of the processes and structure side, which is kind of another stream. So the majority of people that we work with are not companies that are internationalizing for the first time. So they're not people that are now starting to think about adaptation or localization and entering new places, or what countries to launch into next. So these kind of aspects. But they're companies who have gone into 4 or 5 countries and they've gone, oops, somewhere, either because a process is broken, they've grown too quickly and their processes haven't been able to scale accordingly. Maybe one country is not performing as well as the others and they're wanting to work out why. And that's where we come in to help. So we're able to then look at it. If it's a cultural adaptation thing, we can generally do that very quickly. Look at it half an hour and we're like, yep, these things are the important things you missed. If they're on the sort of the process and scalability structure side, then we sit down, work out what's going on, what's not working. The majority of the time, the big issue comes from individual country teams then working in a silo and not really being truly cross-functional or integrated necessarily into the main bucket of the organization, which may only work primarily on the home market. So we then work on processes to integrate that so that there's one process for all markets, and that makes it a lot easier and much more streamlined and a lot more efficient.
Interesting. And I know you work with companies that are going throughout Europe and also into Africa and some into the MENA region. Are there other places that your clients are going, or does that sort of right now kind of encompass the majority?
Yeah, I'd say that's the majority. We don't really do much in Africa right now, and if so, it's very much a small part. It's not really our expertise. Yep. We mainly do a lot in Europe because that is where the expertise of myself and also the rest of my team come in. Because a lot of what we do is also interim management. So we join people, we join their teams for sort of 12, 18 months as an interim country manager or an interim head of international. And so because we're in there with their teams, they're often a little bit more close than that. I did spend 2 years with a client out in Southeast Asia, launching into 5 countries out there, which was very exciting. Learned a lot about that. But mostly these days it's a bit closer, sort of MENA region and Europe.
And the reason I think that's so interesting is, you think about, I guess, an outsider's perception of the EU, and you go, gosh, it's now one big trading group, other than the UK, which is kind of splitting off. But
dangerous questions, Bill. Dangerous questions.
but generally one big trading group, and so the assumption is, gosh, these things must be much simpler now. But clearly, from what you're saying, they're still very unique cultures. They're still very unique, in some cases, financial infrastructure, customer expectations, all of those things by essentially country or jurisdiction. And I guess I throw that out just as maybe as a discussion topic. I see your head nodding, but what are your thoughts around that? Absolutely,
but I agree, we can also take this to a US point of view, right? So I was working with a meal kit company who is active in Europe and in the States. And they have pockets of clients, for example, in New York and in California and in Texas.
Totally
and when you're
looking
at exactly, and they're completely different markets. They tend to eat completely different kinds of food. Totally. They have different expectations. They have their own cultures. Yeah. The only thing is that you have, the same language in most cases. In some cases, it's even more, for example, Spanish speaking or others, for example.
Sure.
And those cultures are also very independent, as well as being American. And the same thing happens kind of in Europe. The only difference is you're dealing with, I did look it up once, I think there's 23 official languages of European Union. There's 23 countries, no, more than that. But if you're looking at also unofficial languages, you're looking at over 50, 70 languages that are being used in different parts. Turkey's not EU, but it's Europe, and they have a dozen languages, easy. Right. And all these different cultures within it. And they do need to be treated a little bit separately. Some things are very similar, how they react to different visual stimuli, layouts of websites, for example, may be much more similar than in other markets or compared to non-European markets. But individually, they are really quite different and unique. They're often grouped, so you'll find that a lot of companies will have regions. So they'll have Western Europe or DACH or Eastern Europe, Nordics, for example. And in those instances, they share a lot of characteristics, and they're able to find a suitable place along this sort of scalability adaptation spectrum. I sort of describe this localization aspect of walking the tightrope between scalability and localization. And when markets are slightly more similar, you're able to go further down that scalability route. That makes more sense. But finding where to go is not the easiest. Definitely.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Does it change a bit by company? In other words, and I would imagine it's also by a little bit by the company's size or their scale currently. But does the strategy in terms of, for example, how many different versions of the website to have, how many languages the website should be in, you were talking about sort of that regional adaptation versus the country level. Does the strategy change a little bit depending on whether it's the company's current sort of status or state and or the product or service may lend itself to be more regionalized versus country specific communication? How do it's got to be, there's a lot, it seems like there's a lot of gray in that process. Yeah. So how do you make that decision?
I think one of the most important things is to make a decision, right? So I think that's actually one of the biggest steps that companies don't take. They don't say, actually, we want to be very scalable. We're prepared to do different languages and we're prepared to do different payment methods. Otherwise, it's the same thing. And that's fine if you're making that decision. But a lot of companies don't have that thought process and that decision making first. And that's going to affect what countries are the most relevant for you to launch into. Because if you're saying, okay, we want to do the scalability thing, make it as similar as possible or as replicable as possible, then you want to pick the markets that are the most similar to your own, because they're more likely to have a similar response. If, for example, you have a very super scalable, and you want it to be super scalable and then go somewhere like China or Japan, that's not going to work, right? So, whereas if you're taking the approach that says, yeah, okay, no, we're prepared to localize for regions as long as they are, I don't know, a certain size together or X, Y, Z, then you can make these then judgment calls. But for sure, it changes by vertical.
Right.
SaaS, for example, much more scalable. B2C tends to be more localized. Food and drink, obviously, very localized. So, yes, it does certainly vary by vertical.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So let's talk about some clients or one or two that you think really got it right, and maybe we'll dissect them a little bit. But is there one, and you certainly don't have to give the company's name, but maybe their industry and a little bit about their product, and then let's just talk about the things that you think that they got right, and maybe we'll talk through some of that those attributes.
Sure. I mean, not necessarily a client, but my favorite example for getting this balance right for me is McDonald's.
Interesting.
They are absolutely my favorite example for this. If you look at McDonald's, so they make a real separation between the process and the product. And this is a good way to think about it when you're looking at adaptation. So their processes are identical. You know that your fries in New York City are going to be the same as your fries in Jakarta, as your fries in Stockholm. They have a very fixed process. They go in the fryer for, 2 minutes, 43 seconds. I don't know what it is. But their processes are the same and you're getting the same thing or very close to the same thing every time. Incredibly scalable, which means they can benefit from the economies of scale and all of the other good things from having things in one fixed approach. On the other hand, if you look at the product is localized. So you might, in some places, you've got a beef rib thing, a McRib sandwich. You don't get fries in some parts of Asia. You have rice instead. I actually have a really interesting slide. I should send it for you to send and put on the screen, with all the different options that they have around the world. They have sort of quesadilla type options in Mexico. In India, for example, they don't have beef burgers, they're all chicken burgers because it's not appropriate to eat beef in that market. So they change their product offering to make it suitable for the market. But then if you go to India, they have chicken rather than beef. But again, the processes at any McDonald's in India is going to be the same. So they're still following this very strict procedure and these very strict processes. So this balance, I think they've had a long time to refine it, but they've done it wonderfully.
Well, in the Northeast U.S. where I am, they actually have lobster rolls. So you can, and obviously a different price point than most of the rest of their menu.
Yes, it's true. And we don't have lobster rolls in Europe. We do have fillet of fish in some places, but no lobster rolls.
Yeah. I think everywhere has the fillet of fish. So is there a client that has sort of taken some of the lessons learned from McDonald's and applied them well?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's a little bit difficult to use that as an example because they're so large. It's a franchise model, and the franchise model does change the game a little bit. But I did have an e-commerce client, for example, where we did this. Not this, but we looked at the issues of scalability and localization quite a lot. So at one point, they were one of the clients who had a very different country silo structure and really need to put things into place to streamline and become more efficient. And part of that sort of streamlining and efficiency process was adding in more scalability parts. So instead of they were in 11 countries at the time. I think at one point, we were in 13 countries at the peak, I believe. And instead of having 13 different banners on the homepage, we cut that right down to having a choice between one or two, whichever one was the most appropriate for what you were seeing, for example. Same with the product. So there were 3 different warehouses that covered these 13 markets. And the content of these warehouses was 95% the same. But then we still had sort of 5% of products that were suitable for that region that we're in, looking more closely at things that were suitable for that market, but maybe not others.
Fantastic. I guess as you look at the companies that have done it well, are there some actual, tangible attributes of the company? What I guess I'm asking is, are there, how important is leadership in this process, and what role do leaders have in sort of managing the navigation of expanding to new markets?
Leadership is absolutely key. There's actually a ton of academic research that's shown that founders and C-levels with international experience are much more likely to succeed in international expansion in the future. So that's a really interesting set of academic research. I'm doing a PhD on the side looking at this scalability localization thing. So I'm being careful not to talk about it all day, which I can and I do in my free time. So yeah, leadership is super important because one of the key things for success is integrating the international teams shouldn't exist, or personal opinion, at least longer term, shouldn't exist. They should be part of the overall process and the overall company rather than being in these individual silos. And so these thoughts about leadership and leaders and how they want to integrate international business into their overall strategy and international and organizational structures is really important. And also understanding that international expansion is more than just a bottom line number. So there's a number of founders or C-levels that are like, great, we're doing great in this market, let's grow. Where's the biggest market? Oh, great, throw it in a dartboard. That's the biggest market. Let's go there. without necessarily putting much thought behind it. So any leader who asks themselves questions, preferably sensible questions, but any questions to why they're making these decisions and what they're thinking about, is already 10 steps ahead of the general market.
So that actually leads me to a kind of maybe a little bit of a curious question. That is, what role does ego play? Thinking about leaders, and I guess my notion here is that if you don't have a reasonable ego, or enough ego, you'd never actually begin the process of international expansion. On the other hand, if you have too much ego, there may be dangers there. And I guess I'd love your thought about ego and its role in success for international expansion.
That's a really interesting question. I think there has to be ambition. I don't know if that's part of ego. I guess if the point is I have to be the best, I'm going to succeed, I'm always going to be number one, be the world's best, then yes, that has to have some part of it. But I think overall, you have to be able to put that aside to be successful internationally, because you're going to mess up. Whatever you've learned from your home country, probably not going to be true. 80% of all international expansions fail, and there's a reason for that. And that's often due to a lack of product market fit in the new country, or lack of cultural awareness, lack of adaptation. So some of the things we've been talking about. And if people's egos are too large that they're not able to accept that it's different and accept the advice of locals, essentially, or local experts, then that's where you're going to have a bit of a problem. So I guess it depends what form this ego takes. If they're able to say, I want to be the best, and I'm gonna stoke my ego by creating the number one company and getting the right advice from everybody around, okay, great.
Right.
If it's, I know better, I'm doing it this way, it's worked, that's where it's gonna go wrong.
Right. Again, ego is sort of a fuel, but it's also we can also point it the wrong direction, I suppose, is the challenge of any catalyst. It's always interesting because as I observe international expansion, I think there are general things we sort of always talk about. There's sort of things that we know are best practice or challenge or whatnot. And rarely do I hear about ego, but quite often ego can be a catastrophic limiter, it seems. And it's not even as much to do with international expansion, although the stakes are just bigger, and the risks are higher. And it seems like if anywhere we're going to learn how to listen, and learn how to and I don't even mean listen and I think listening to people who have done it before and experts is really important, but I first mean listen to the customer, and don't make this customer assumptions transferable from this market to that market, but go in with whatever and understand whatever strategy you go in with is a hypothesis, and that that there's a nimbleness to it. And I guess it's a curious observation that we see it all the time, but I think it's a really good coachable moment as to hey, you can sort of forecast, hey, understand these blind spots are going to come up, and they're going to be these variety of things that you're going to want to sort of project what which please do, because those are great hypotheses, but understand that that our better strategy is actually going to be to develop systems to test those hypotheses and
test and learn every time.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it doesn't just depend on the ego of the founders or the leaders. It also needs to be a lot of them are often pushed by VCs and investors.
Sure.
So they're financially driven, of course, because they want a return on the money that's given out. And that can often put a lot of pressure on leaders and founders to make these leaps that may not actually be the best choice for their business. or encourage them to make potentially hasty decisions about the direction of their growth, which then obviously impacts their success rate.
Yeah.
We see that a few times too.
Well, good stuff. Well, let's talk about how do companies begin the process. If I were a company based somewhere in Europe, let's say Spain, and I want to expand through Europe from Spain. What are the things? Where should I begin the process in terms of my discovery and kind of learning how to get my company expanded into some of the key markets in Europe?
Mm-hmm. I would say that if you really have no idea how to go about that, get help from somebody that does know. Either somebody like me or governmental agencies, which can be also a great use of a resource that you can go to. But you need to understand what your goal is from doing this. Why do you want to expand? Is it for strategic reasons to prevent competitors getting a market? Is it for extra revenue? Why is it you're looking to expand? Because that's going to dictate the answers to some of your questions. But also what is your business, right? So if you're in Spain and you are a fishing company, let's say, going to Austria or Liechtenstein, I don't know, might not be, or Hungary, might not be the best choice for you, right? So looking at the market and the industry, realistically, most people are going to have a short list in their head anyway of places that are relevant for them and that are going to be interesting because of XYZ, whatever criteria. You probably know it's your business and your industry. And from my side, it's perfectly fine to make that short list as quite arbitrarily, actually. And I, in some ways, recommend it. But then you need to, again, think about how much localization do you want to do? How much are you prepared to change your company? If you're a SaaS company, not really a concern. Then you can, that's an overarching statement, but if you're in that line, there is less adaptation to be made on most occasions. Where do you fit in that? And do you need to do this adaptation? Where? Do you want to say, no, we are only we're in Spain, this is our expertise. We can't, maybe you're in a tiny little village somewhere, it's a family business. You can't easily find non-Spanish speakers. Actually, maybe you should look at South America because you don't want to look at other languages. So work out what your boundaries are. And once you've worked out what your sort of frame is, you know where you're then working within it. And you can then start looking at markets that make sense, working on criteria that is important for you. And then what I recommend people to do, and what I do with my clients, is to then work on this criteria and build a balanced scorecard by comparing different markets that fulfill this base criteria that you can then move into.
Very cool. Wow, that's great. And it's something that I don't think is said enough, but you just said it right off the top, is you know what your goal is and make sure that everything you do is aligned with that outcome. It totally makes sense. Yeah. That's great.
And that means not only knowing what your goal is, but knowing what success and failure is like. So most companies, and this is something I've also learned over the years, I certainly did not know this to start, is really work out what failure means to you as an international expansion. So do you want to be number one in every market? Because that means if you're a solid number two, you should leave that market because you have not reached your goal, right? Or is it just that you want to be profitable in every market so it can self-sustain? Also fine. But really understand what failure means for you. Because if you've got a really profitable market, but it's number two, and that's not where you want to go, you need to decide if you're going to keep it, why you're going to keep it. Do you need to change your overall strategy to say, actually, no, we care more about profit than winning the market? Or actually, no, winning the market is the most important thing. I've known companies to leave markets that they were relatively profitable in because they were third or fourth in the market, and for them, they wanted to be seen as the market leader. And if they weren't the market leader, then they didn't want to be there.
Wow.
And I know other companies that would cry if at the thought of leaving a profitable market, no matter where they were, right? So
Yeah.
really understanding what success and failure means to you and being prepared to act on that no matter where it comes. Doesn't mean the decisions are easy if you get there, but it's important to think about it in advance.
Well, yeah, the idea that you've scripted it, and yeah, and you've set some parameters around expectations and all that, that makes total sense. Well, this has been great. So I wanted to talk for a couple minutes, if we can, about you joined us at Softland Partners now as a chapter leader a couple months ago, and we just launched the Berlin chapter, which it had its first meeting a few weeks back, and it was fantastic. But I really wanted to chat with you, check in about that, and kind of see, when we spoke originally, I just remember how excited you were with sort of the promise of sort of what this network and group could do. And I really just wanted to explore that for a couple of minutes. Maybe you could reflect a little bit on kind of what your hope is in terms of how this can whether it's change sort of the success of individual companies, or what effect it can have. But what was your hope as you got sort of that original promise, if you will?
Yes, we did have our first meeting. I'm still very excited by this, because I think there's a lot that we can do. The Berlin ecosystem is huge in terms of startups and expansion. There's a lot of regional companies that are based here, particularly in terms of e-commerce, mobility, biotech. There's a lot of these sort of regional hubs here, which means there's a lot of potential for Softland partners and people working in the market entry space to really make a difference. But a lot of these companies or freelancers, I mean, I freelanced for a few years here myself, it is much more common than a couple of larger players. So one thing that I really thought was cool is that we put everybody in one place. So we'd have different members, let's say different people would run a lot of events or things for potential clients or for the companies, but there was no institution that brought all of us as service providers, as vendors, as experts together in this field. So that's kind of my hope to do that, to bring this network of people together so that we can ultimately work together and share best practices and learn from each other. That was one thing that I'm really enjoying most, actually, about the meetups that I'm attending, is learning how people in other places are solving these issues and the things that they're doing. Because when you're in a very small niche like internationalization, it's not like we are Facebook marketers, for example. The community is smaller and more precise. You lack that community and that those people behind you to help you, that someone to spar with. And I hope that people are able to come together and find that person or those people in that group to spar with and learn more about and to bring it forward.
That's cool. Yeah, no, the what you said about the Berlin ecosystem is so interesting, because everywhere I travel, Berlin is certainly one of the key marketplaces that people talk about in terms of both the startup community and just the internationalization activity that's going on there. It's really remarkable to see. Is there if somebody were listening who is interested in getting involved in the Berlin Softland Partners chapter, is there a message you would want to make sure they hear?
Yeah, do it. At the end of the day,
that's succinct.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you've got nothing to lose. You can come to a meetup, try it out, see if you like it, see if you like us. We try and be nice, but we don't bite unless you ask nicely. So you've got nothing to lose by coming to see and to try it out and to meet some new people. For me, the most interesting thing, actually, because the Berlin group is quite new, it's quite nascent, but some of the chapters in the States, for example, have been meeting for a lot longer. And learning from them and talking with them and having one-on-ones with some of the other people in the wider community has been super valuable to learn a lot more from others. And that for me actually is what I've got out of it the most, is people that I wouldn't otherwise have a chance to meet. Because there's a chance I'll run into some of the Berlin chapter people at an event or for drinks or whatever. I'm probably not going to meet the chapter leaders in New York or Sao Paulo or Mumbai, right? So
Not
that
until we
for
get
me
big
is,
enough to have that international meeting.
so that for me is really what I get out of it a lot.
That's awesome. No, and that's so much the intent is not only to help get the dense local ecosystems very strong, but to really help build the bridges between ecosystems globally. And yeah, obviously that's a huge part of internationalization, and we want to really align with that as well. But well, it's been delightful, Nina. I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. Are there any sort of final words you want to share before we sign off for today?
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. Final words, I would just say, if you want to go international, prepare, but do it. I mean, it's one of the most fun things that you can do as a business. It's hard and it's difficult, but it's really rewarding and challenging. Just prepare properly and go for it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking your time with us today. Really appreciate it. I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you so much.
Thank you.